Good evening, everybody. Hell's Unicorn here once again. I'm just going to do a little quick talk about the topic of gay marriage and gay rights because this is something that's come up a lot and something that I haven't really given, I don't think, a full opinion on. Part of my inspiration in doing this was the episode of The O'Reilly Factor that was on tonight. And the segment with Ann Coulter in particular, where Ann Coulter was just haranguing on and on in her usual snarky, pseudo-intellectual, bitchy self about how libertarians are meaningless because they don't have a clear stance on the marriage issue. To preface my assertion here, I'm just going to state something for everyone. Before the late 19th century, there was no federal marriage licensing in this country. It did not exist. Let me ask all of you something. If this country had no marriage licensing for the first 100 some odd years that it was in existence, how, pray tell, according to Ann Coulter's logic, did we all just not turn gay and basically die off? Just throwing that question out there for all of you. It's a rhetorical one, and it obviously has a very simple response, which is, we didn't, ergo, this is false logic. I consider myself a pretty socially conservative person. I'm pretty well as strongly pro-life as you get. I generally tend to detest most abortion activist groups, and I would like to see Planned Parenthood permanently removed from anywhere within the borders of Pennsylvania. That is a personal desire that I have. I don't know if I'll ever see the day that it'll happen, but I can hope. The problem with the whole marriage issue, because I know that neocons and ultra social conservative types love to harangue on this issue, is that we're not dealing with an issue of interpersonal violence here. We're dealing with an issue of consent between two people by way of contract. But if we want to go the conservative route and look at the institution of marriage, then we should probably go back to the beginning. And the beginning is Genesis chapters 1 through 3. The relationship between man and wife is pretty well established in these first three books. My question to to all of you is, which church was present for this marriage, this archetype of how Christianity and Judaism defines marriage, how basically most people of the heterosexual persuasion tend to define marriage? The answer is there was no church, because there was no need for a church. According to Christian theology, there was no fall. Adam and Eve were in perfect union with God, and thus a covenant was struck under which man and wife would unite and become one flesh. In scientific terms, 2 X chromosomes, 1 X and 1 Y chromosome, join them together, and thus you have offspring. Heterosexual marriage is an important part of the continuation of the species from the standpoint that it provides all of the posterity with the type to which they themselves will aspire to when they seek to raise their own progeny. In more layman's terms, children see both of their parents and take that as an example as to how they should conduct their lives. Parents are role models. Even Charles Barkley can admit that. There's nothing in the first 3 chapters of Genesis that says that we need to establish a state standard for what marriage is. And there is nothing anywhere in the Old or New Testament that states that Caesar has to approve of a marriage. So, by good necessary consequence, we can conclude that there is no actual reasoning by which any church in understanding of Scripture can support federal, state, or even local licensing of marriages. There's only one who can license a marriage, and that's God. And if God is not a part of the equation, then only the consenting parties can do this. The libertarian answer to the marriage question is simple, in part because it's right. In human terms, the union is a contractual agreement, and thus it falls under the jurisdiction of the courts who deal with contract enforcement and interpretation. So there is nothing that the church is really commanded to do to interfere with contract agreements between persons not within its own jurisdiction. Most homosexuals and people of other alternative lifestyles do not identify themselves as Christian, or if they do, they identify with a church that has a different doctrine that allows for this. That's a different government, as far as I see it, being a Christian of the old Catholic faith. I have no dominion over them. I have no say in what they do. Even if they live next door to me, they are not of my congregation, hence they are out of my influence. If we ever have a conversation on the topic, I'll give my opinion on it. But my opinion, my viewpoint, and in the views of some, my prejudices, count for absolutely nothing regarding what two people not in my congregation do. If they are a part of my congregation and the church decides that they don't want to allow it, there are means by which these people can leave the congregation. Nobody's forcing them to stay. And there are churches that they can go to if they wish to proceed on with Christian worship. At the end of the day, it is God's place to separate the wheat from the chaff, and to separate the wheat from the tares also. Those are two distinct parables there. We are commanded to worship and to love God to the best of our ability as Christians. That's what I profess to do. Beyond that, my authority is limited to the bounds of good Republican constitutional government. And good constitutional government dictates that there is no place for marriage to be licensed by anyone other than God. Henceforth, the federal government, as far as I'm concerned, is committing blasphemy by entertaining the notion that we need to have some sort of constitutional amendment defining marriage a certain way. Marriage has already been defined. The only thing the government is doing here is attempting to supplant authority that is not theirs to take. So I'm approaching this from a very different angle than most people who want gays to be able to do whatever they want to do. Indeed, they can do whatever they want. From my standpoint, it's not so much an issue of me supporting what they're doing. It's just an issue of I don't care. It's not my concern, and I don't involve myself in the concerns of others, unless our concerns intersect with each other at some specific point. The problem with people like Ann Coulter is that they're not just simply interested in doing the right thing. They're interested in conquest. Not just conquest of arms. I mean, Ann Coulter is a raving homicidal lunatic when it comes to foreign policy. But domestically, the woman's a control freak. And much like that tiny little creepy Polynesian woman, Michelle Malkin, she probably has no problem putting people into camps for not thinking the right way, not behaving the right way, or potentially even being of the wrong race or religion. And that scares the hell out of me. Because I'll tell you one thing right now, Ann Coulter and I are not on the same page theologically. And it's a pretty safe bet that we never will be. We both might confess Christ, but I don't think we're confessing the same one. So in truth, only one of us is actually confessing Christ, and I would argue it's not her that's doing it. But that's a discussion for another day. The long and short of it is, the answer to the licensing problem is simple, because it's very obvious what the problem is. The problem is not that gay people will do what they want. Everybody does what they want regardless of what the law says. The more unreasonable laws that are passed, the only thing that increases is the contempt that people have for the law. If laws are unreasonable, reasonable people are going to think that they're silly, and they are right in doing so. No, people that think this way are only interested in control. They like to put up a ruse, a subterfuge, stating that they're doing this for everybody's own good. But I'm not really seeing any explanation as to how any of this is good. I see no benefit whatsoever than government coerced breeding, which is basically done indirectly through all of these so-called tax incentives. All of this attempt to subsidize marriage is simply so that we will birth progeny that will be used either as worker bees or cannon fodder. We either put them through the schools so they learn to obey, or we put them into the military where they will most likely be killed in some stupid war that some stupid politician came up for stupid reasons. This is not about saving the family, this notion of licensing marriages. Nothing extra-constitutional where the federal government is involved is about saving or protecting anything. It's all about getting you to obey, getting me to obey. And I'm not going to do that. I'm tired of obeying. I'm tired of saying, yes, sir, I will gladly kill 500,000 Iraqis by subsidizing your oil for food scheme with my tax money. Not doing it. Not going to consent openly. I am going to protest. I am going to raise hell about it. And when the local neocon affiliate who's campaigning for Michelle Bachmann or whatever comes up to me and says constitutional amendment banning gay marriage, I'm going to say, you know something? No. I'd rather have a constitutional amendment banning you from my doorstep, you authoritarian piece of garbage. My advice to those of you that are on the fence on this issue, this gay marriage issue, if a battle can't be won, don't fight it. And at the end of the day, it's not about controlling. It's simply about being in control. There's a difference. Controlling people is exerting force outside of yourself to get others to conform to you. Being in control is understanding that the only rightful power that you have is over yourself and how you conform yourself to the environment in which you live in. That's my piece on this matter. As far as I'm concerned, licensing of marriage is an abomination unless it's done within the confines of two consenting adults or within a church of one's choosing. At the end of the day, it's all up to a person who may or may not exist depending on who you are. And that's it for this time around. With prudence to myself and benevolence to all of you, good evening.